Built in 1958, the Edmund Fitzgerald was the biggest and longest ship, which made it the Queen of the Lakes. It could carry 29,000 2,000-pound tons of cargo, or 26,000 long tons. Not only could the Edmund Fitzgerald carry record-breaking amounts of cargo, but it was a beautiful ship. With a relatively sleek hull and a colorful red and yellow smokestack, it was quite a nice ship to see. Because it was such a great ship, it became known as the Pride of the American Side. At 729 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 39 feet in depth, it could maintain good speed at 16 miles per hour thanks to its power plant, which could produce 7,500 horsepower. The Edmund Fitzgerald's engine room was quite impressive. The propulsion turbine could produce a continuous maximum power output of 8,250 horsepower. At the heart of this power plant were two D-type boilers that were fired with coal by Detroit rotostokers. Air was supplied to the boilers with 20 and 15 horsepower forced and induced draft fans, which were powered by electric motors. The Edmund Fitzgerald had 4 100 horsepower main ballast pumps and 2 25 horsepower auxiliary ballast pumps. The Fitz had 2 50 horsepower circulating pumps to cool the condenser. The main feed water pump was powered by a 100 horsepower motor, and the auxiliary feed pump ran on steam. All this electricity was generated by 2 400 kilowatt steam turbine alternators. Fitzgerald's first trip was on September 24, 1958. For 17 years, she hauled taconite pellets from Duluth, Minnesota and Superior, Wisconsin to steel mills in Detroit, Toledo, and other Great Lakes ports. A typical round trip took 5 days, about 4.5 hours to load and 14 hours to unload, making roughly 47 voyages each season. By late 1975, she had completed around 748 round trips and steamed over 1 million miles. Enough to circle the globe 44 times. When she first entered service, she was the longest ship ever on the Great Lakes and earned the nickname Queen of the Lakes until September 1959. She broke her own hull record 6 times, with her biggest single load topping out at 27,402 long tons in 1969. It was a nice day on November 9, 1975, and the Edmund Fitzgerald was in Superior, Wisconsin loading taconite at the ore docks right next to the Wilfred Sykes. Since the weather was so nice, no one expected a storm. The ship was loaded with a little more than 26,000 long tons of taconite, which made it slightly overloaded. It was designed for a draft of 25 feet, but it was loaded to about 28 feet. For comparison, when the Fitz was overloaded, its freeboard was 11 feet, while the Anderson's freeboard was 10 feet under a normal full load. At 2:30, the Edmund Fitzgerald departed Superior, and the Wilfred Sykes followed a few hours later. Shortly before the Fitzgerald departed Superior, the Arthur M. Anderson left Two Harbors, Minnesota. Since the Fitz had 500 more horsepower in its engine, it caught up to and passed the Anderson. At 7 p.m., gale warnings were issued on Lake Superior, and on the morning of November 10, storm warnings were issued. Captain Paquette of the Wilfred Sykes didn't want to get caught in a storm, so he brought his ship into Thunder Bay to hide from the big waves. The Fitzgerald and the Anderson stayed on the north end of the lake to stay away from the biggest of the waves. The wind was howling away at 57 miles per hour, and the waves were about 14 feet tall. The two ships, the Anderson and the Fitzgerald, were being battered by the storm, but their captains were not scared. Ernest McSorley had seen many storms and had been a captain since before the Edmund Fitzgerald was built. J.B. Cooper, the captain of the Anderson, was also quite experienced. They felt safe because all of their ships were modern, big, and had powerful steam turbine engines. They were able to see other ships on radar and communicate easily with the radio telephone. These two ships were superior to older ships, and they had welded hulls instead of rivets. Older ships like the Daniel J. Morrell, which sank in 1966, were not as well built and not as well designed as the modern ships. The Morrell was built in 1906, and when it was 60 years old, it split in half during a storm on Lake Huron. There was not a distress call, and just one man survived on a raft. Shortly after the Big Fitz was built in 1958, the Carl D. Bradley twisted and broke in half during a storm on Lake Michigan. 2 men survived on a raft for hours during the massive storm. Built in 1927, it was a very modern ship with a self-unloader and a powerful turboelectric propulsion system. It was the biggest up until the Wilfred Sykes was built in 1949. The Edmund Fitzgerald was big, powerful, well-built, and new. For it to sink like the Morrell and the Bradley would have been unthinkable and seemingly impossible. The Fitzgerald passed by Michipicoten Island and passed by Caribou Island, coming close to the 6 Fathoms Shoal. Captain J.B. Cooper of the Arthur M. Anderson watched on radar and thought that the Fitz came dangerously close to the shoal. Captain Ernest McSorley said on radio to the Arthur M. Anderson that his ship was missing some ballast tank vent pipes and the fence wires had snapped. The Fitz had also taken on a list suddenly, and some ballast pumps were turned on to discharge the water that was flooding in. At about 6:55, Captain Cooper and his men felt a bump and looked back to see a giant wave coming down the deck. The big wave crashed into the back of the superstructure, and then another rogue wave hit the Anderson. The mighty ship floated back up as water gushed off the spar deck, and it was not harmed. At about 7:10, a crewman on the Anderson asked, "Fitzgerald, how are you making out with your problem?" Captain McSorley replied, "We are holding our own." Shortly after, the Edmund Fitzgerald was hidden by a snow squall. 7:20 p.m., the crew of the Anderson tried to communicate with the Edmund Fitzgerald on radio, but no response. The Big Fitz could not be seen on radar, and when the snow cleared, no lights could be seen. The captain of the Arthur M. Anderson radioed the Coast Guard and other ships and asked if they could see the Fitzgerald. The crew of other ships were not able to see the Edmund Fitzgerald, and the captain of the Anderson was becoming very worried that the Big Fitz had gone down. The Anderson was in Whitefish Bay, where the force of the storm was not as bad. The Coast Guard called Captain Cooper at 9 o'clock and requested he leave the safety of Whitefish Bay and go search for the Edmund Fitzgerald. Captain Cooper hesitantly agreed. The Arthur Anderson was pounded by 25-foot waves and rolled badly as it fought head-on into the seas. One other ship, the SS William Clay Ford, left Whitefish Bay to search. The crew of the Arthur M. Anderson ended up finding the Edmund Fitzgerald's lifeboats and other things, but no crew. The Wilfred Sykes came out of Thunder Bay in the morning of November 11 and participated in the search effort in hopes of finding a crew member. After the Edmund Fitzgerald sank, it was not clear what happened. There had been no distress call and there were no survivors to tell what happened. What was known was that the Fitz had been taking on water and was listing. The ballast pumps were working and Captain McSorley thought he could make it to Whitefish Bay. The Coast Guard came up with the theory that the hatch covers were not clamped down tightly enough and water leaked in that way. This theory was not well liked because ship captains believed that even in a storm the hatches would not leak enough to sink a big ship. Captain Cooper of the Anderson had a theory that was much more popular. He believes that when he saw the Fitz get close to 6 Fathoms Shoal, it scraped the bottom. It was shortly after passing by 6 Fathoms Shoal by Caribou Island when Captain McSorley reported that the ship was flooding. His crew knew this because the king gauges in the engine room showed the water level in the ballast tanks was rising. Captain Dudley Paquette of the Wilfred Sykes thought that because the Fitz was overloaded, it suffered a stress fracture which caused a leak and the wire railing to snap. This theory is quite plausible since in the summer of 2024, the freighter Michipicoten sprung a leak due to a stress fracture and almost sank. He also blamed a lack of maintenance for the ship splitting up. There was a spare propeller blade on the deck and Captain Paquette thought that it may have broken loose and knocked out the ballast tank vents. With the vent pipes broken, air escaped from the ballast tanks and allowed water to come in, which explains the sudden list. In my opinion, the captain's theories are the best. It seems unlikely that enough water could seep through the hatches to overwhelm the powerful ballast pumps. When Captain McSorley told the crew of the Anderson that he had 2 ballast pumps running, he may have been referring to the auxiliary ballast pumps, which could pump 2,000 gallons per minute. That's 4,000 gallons per minute combined. I really don't think that much water could leak through the hatches. The theory of grounding on 6 Fathoms Shoal or a stress fracture are more likely. I think only a big cut in the bottom of the ship's hull could have allowed in enough water to overwhelm the ballast pumps. When Captain McSorley reported that the railing was down and some ballast tank vents were missing, the only possibility was a spare propeller blade. That is the only object big enough to destroy solid steel vent pipes. When the Fitz went down around 7:15 p.m., it was already flooded with water and riding dangerously low in the water. The rogue waves that hit the Anderson about 20 minutes earlier probably caught up to the already sinking ship and are likely what finished it off. The big waves could have dunked the bow underwater and caved in the pilot house windows, preventing the crew from calling for help. The bow plunged underwater and hit the bottom, causing the ship to break in half. Whatever happened, we will never know for sure, but we can make good guesses of what likely happened. The sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald was the last shipwreck on the Great Lakes, and there had been many other shipwrecks before it, including the forgotten Roy A. Jodery that ran aground in the St. Lawrence River in 1974. The Great Lakes are some of the safest bodies of water, and it's great that there have been no shipwrecks for 50 years. I have made this video because the Edmund Fitzgerald was a very interesting ship, and so people can learn about what the ship was like. It's important that we all remember what happened to preserve the history and memory of the Edmund Fitzgerald and the 29 men who went down with it.